And why is it that the United States was so provocative, has been so provocative towards Russia?
Because after the end of the Soviet Union, we thought, hey, we're pretty good. We're the sole superpower. We're the most powerful country on the planet by far in world history. We can do pretty much what we want. And that really was the view in both political parties. So it's not really a partisan thing. It is what we call a neoconservative thing. It was the idea that, hey, we can whoop who we want when we want, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. We can stick it to Vladimir Putin. We are the United States of America. And we acted on that. We had, remember, Cheney and Rumsfeld and that crowd? Well, we have them in both parties. We have Victoria Nuland in this administration, who was out there helping to overthrow a pro-Russian president of Ukraine in 2014, and now she's the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So we have these neocons who say, compromise? Are you kidding? We're the United States. And since we think we're so powerful, well, we're in Afghanistan. That's great. Syria, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine. Oh, so successful. And I say, are you kidding? My whole life, I was born a long time ago in 1954. I grew up in the Vietnam War period, and it wasn't just Vietnam. It was Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. I went through the Contras in Nicaragua. I went through Afghanistan, the first Iraq War, the second Iraq War, the CIA operation to overthrow Bashar al-Assad, the NATO operation to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. Now the U.S. role in overthrowing Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian Ukrainian president in 2014, this expansion of NATO being tried right now. I just think, yeah, we're powerful, but is this really good for the United States? Is this really working? And my answer is no, it's not working well. And most of all, when Putin said last year, look, the red line is don't expand NATO. And immediately the White House said, oh, no one tells us what to do, least of all Russia. And I called the White House and I said, you should listen. Do not put Ukraine into this situation. You will make Ukraine the Afghanistan of Europe. And by that, I mean a perpetual war and leveling these cities in Ukraine, as we're watching right now, and millions of people without heat and electricity. And we say, yeah, we're winning. Come on, we're not winning. This is not the right way to behave.
And who did you speak to at the White House, and how was it received?
It was not well received, and I didn't make any headway.
Right. Did you speak to Biden himself?
No.
No, okay.
I spoke to advisors.
Yeah. You're someone who has a lot of access, and although it's probably been changing because you've been saying things that are considered heretical.
They don't love what I'm saying. Let's put it that way. I don't know whether, they still hear me.
Right.
So it's pretty much one way.
Right. Yeah. I was going to say, do you think that you've changed your politics or your view of the world? You've had such a long and prolific career, and you're very well respected and established. And it almost shocks me that someone of your stature says things that are outside of the mainstream as you do. I mean that as a compliment. Is this something you've always had, or is this a newer thing?
Well, it grew over time, because when I started my career, which was 1980, I got my PhD and I became an assistant professor at Harvard University. I can tell you, because I remember it, how proud I was to be an American economist in the world. I studied international economics, so I was going to go out and solve international problems as an American. And I thought that was pretty cool. My hero intellectually is a well-known, very famous British economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes, I was very deeply influenced, like many in my generation. But I read a lot of Keynes's essays, and I just loved the guy, how intelligent and smart he was, and decent. And he, at the time, was, an economist when Britain was with such power and influence. And I thought, that was interesting because he could get something done that was quite good. And I felt really proud that, I'm lucky to be an American at this time when America has this ability to help solve global problems. And here I am starting my career, and I'm going to help solve global problems as an American economist. And I felt that way for a number of years. But then I saw more and more that I didn't really like. And for me, a big turning point is when I became an advisor, always, by the way, unpaid. I don't do this commercially. I do this as a public intellectual, so-called, or as an academic. But I became an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev's economic team, and then I became an advisor to Boris Yeltsin's economic team. And I knew, really from Keynes, by the way, that when the country that you're trying to help is in really, really deep financial crisis, after all, the whole system had completely collapsed, then that country needs some help to get back on its feet. And that was really my main message in 1990, 1991, 1992. And I helped Poland get back on its feet economically. And everything I recommended, by the way, the White House adopted almost right away. And I said, oh, God, good. They're listening to every word. And then I said the same thing about the Soviet Union with Gorbachev. Zero. Sachs, are you crazy? We're not going to help the Soviet Union. They're our enemy. And then when Soviet Union ended and Yeltsin's economic team asked me to help, I said the same thing about Russia. Again, zero. I thought that's pretty weird because what I'm recommending for Russia is exactly what I recommended for Poland, and it worked for Poland, and the White House supported what I recommended for Poland, but in the same conditions, it doesn't do it for Russia. I was a little naive, I have to say, because as an economist, I was making economic recommendations, how to help. But I don't think the mood of Rumsfeld and Cheney and others in 1992 was to help. It was, hey, we are the sole world superpower. We get to change everything right now. And then I waited with Clinton coming in, no real change. And then on, and I began to see that and understand better, quite frankly, as you grow up in this, because I've really worked all over the world and quite extensively in well over 100 countries. I visited most of the world and know most of the world leaders one way or another, or many, many of them. And I came to understand that the U.S. was a little bit unhinged, and that the disasters of the Vietnam War era, which I knew full well because I had marched in the streets against the Vietnam War, and Watergate and the abuses, the Contra wars in Central America, and I also worked in Central America in those years. Those were not simply aberrations. Those were part of the design set, and you become more sophisticated. You see a lot of lying that is lying because as I, have become much more, for 20 years, I've been a senior advisor to the United Nations on many things. I see a lot. I hear a lot. And I don't like it when we're not telling the truth. And I find it quite dangerous, and I don't like the spin and the narratives, and I don't like wars that are fought as narratives. I don't like it when we say, and for some reason, our mainstream media repeat, well, this war was an unprovoked war that started February 24th, 2022. No, There were lots of provocations, and I know some of them firsthand, and I know many, many of them by things that leaders have told me in detail. And I understand the provocations. Or today, there's a New York Times story about how the Germans connived, let's put it that way, to build the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Russia. And because they wanted natural gas from Russia. The United States opposed that. And I've been saying for months, well, who blew up that pipeline? That would almost surely be the United States. If someone has some other evidence, show me. But otherwise, I know a lot of motivation and capacity that the U.S. did it. And President Biden on February 7th of this year said, if Russia invades, the Nord Stream pipeline is finished. And then the incredulous reporter said, but Mr. President, that's a Russian-German pipeline. And the president responded, believe me, we have our ways. And so today in the New York Times, they talk about Germany and Russia building the pipeline against U.S. opposition. But then when it comes to the paragraph, the short message about the destruction, they say nobody knows who did it. Come on. If you're the New York Times, when I was growing up, the New York Times was looking into Watergate. The New York Times was looking into the lies of the Vietnam War and so on. You know, it had an active view that the government doesn't tell the truth. So you go out to find out what the truth is. Now the New York Times is like, suck your thumb. Don't ask anything. Don't ask any question. Don't be curious. We don't know who blew up the pipeline. I'll give another example. You know, Ukraine has been shelling the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. Well, maybe it's understandable. They want the power plant back. Russia grabbed the power plant. But it's dangerous to shell a nuclear power plant. In fact, it's reckless to shell a nuclear power plant. So we should be saying to our ally, Ukraine, don't shell a nuclear power plant. Instead, the New York Times says almost every day, each side accuses the other of shelling the nuclear power plant. Well, I can tell you and I can tell your listeners, because I'm well briefed on it, that Ukraine is shelling the nuclear power plant. Oh, but we're not allowed to say that. Excuse me. We can't say that. So this is the problem, Katie. So you asked me how I feel about it. I feel about it that we should tell the truth, because actually the world's really complicated. It's really in trouble. And grown-ups should behave like grown-ups. That's my bottom line.
And there are some interesting recent examples of you telling the truth and the response to you when you tell the truth. Hold on, let's see. So this is you on Bloomberg television.
I remember the moment.
I'm sure. I'm sure it's seared in your memory.
The destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which I would bet was a U.S. action, perhaps U.S. and Poland. This is
right, Jeff,
speculation.
we got to stop there. That's quite a statement as well. Why do you feel
Absolutely.
that was a U.S. action? What evidence do you have of that?
Well, first of all, there's direct radar evidence that U.S. Helicopters, military helicopters that are normally based in Gdansk, were circling over this area. We also had the threats from the United States earlier in this year that one way or another, we are going to end Nord Stream. We also have a remarkable statement by Secretary Blinken last Friday in a press conference. He says, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a strange way to, it's a strange way to talk if you're worried about the piracy on international infrastructure of vital significance. So I know this runs counter to our narrative. You're not allowed to say these things in the West. But the fact of the matter is, all over the world, when I talk to people, they think the U.S. did it. Just to tell you, and by the way, even reporters on our papers that are involved tell me privately, yeah, well, of course, but it doesn't show up in our media.
Professor, I don't want to get into tit for tat about what did or did not.
So that was an interesting response.
Well, it was a little bit of a funny moment because, you know, usually I'm on that I'll probably never be on that show again,
Right.
but I've been on that show many times, and usually they have me on for, 2 or 3 of the segments, maybe up to half an hour. And after that, I was off. And then when I was off, one of the anchors, not the 2 that you saw, but the third one, went after me for 5 minutes. They didn't cut off my camera so I could watch on my Zoom. And he just, ad hominem attack for 5 minutes. And, of course, I wasn't around to speak about
Respond to it, right.
But this is a problem that it's a game of narratives right now. And we don't need games. We actually need real discussion of very serious issues before we blow ourselves up by mistake or just blunder or misinformation or so many other possibilities.
Right. And here's another example of you saying something that people seem a bit uncomfortable with. And this is from the Athens Democracy Forum in October.
Yes.
Just playing some of your greatest hits here.
The most violent country in the world in the 19th century, by far, was perhaps the most democratic or second most democratic, and that was Britain. You can be democratic at home and ruthlessly imperial abroad. The most violent country in the world since 1950 has been the United States. It's been by far involved
Jeffrey,
in more,
stop
wait a
now.
minute, in more
Let's
wars.
Jeffrey. I'm Jeffrey. I'm your moderator, and it's enough.
Okay, I'm done.
That was another interesting moment. They didn't seem very comfortable with what you were saying.
Yeah, the truth is I had talked on a long time, so I probably talked too long, but also I should have been allowed to finish the thought.
Right.
It was actually a real and serious point that I was making, which is that all my life the U.S. has been in wars, and wars of choice, and wars that have gone badly, and wars that have inflicted incredible harm on other people and damage to the U.S. and costing trillions of dollars. And we should acknowledge that and understand this. It's a little hard because some of this is so completely underreported. You might think wars would have to be reported. But one example that I know quite a bit about is Syria. We say that Syria had a civil war, or that it had a rebellion against Assad in 2011. But what Americans never heard about was the presidential finding by Obama that the CIA should work together with the other countries in the Middle East to overthrow Assad. In other words, this was a regime change operation. And I think regime change operations are awful. We shouldn't be doing them. They are incredibly destructive and filled with lies, especially when they're covert, as this one was. And we never discussed the U.S. role in this. Everything was basically the lie that there's an insurrection and we're helping the freedom fighters, not that the United States is actively trying to overthrow a government. And is that right, or is that wrong? Is that a decent idea? And one of the things that Putin sees is that the U.S. does that a lot. It shouldn't be a secret, but it's not well understood. Of course, we overthrew Saddam Hussein. We tried to overthrow Assad and failed. We overthrew and basically led to the murder of Muammar Gaddafi. We overthrew the Afghan government. But even more than that, what Americans really don't know and should know is that in 1979, it was the CIA that funded the Mujahideen, which was the precursor of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and all of that We did that as a lure to try to draw the Soviet Union into a war in Afghanistan. Really a deep, dirty trick that now not only ended up destroying Afghanistan over the course of many decades, but drew the United States into this complete morass for 40 years as well. And then Putin says, I don't want NATO on my border. And the United States says, oh, why? Don't be paranoid. We're a defensive, peace-loving country. You know, when you know a bit, you just say, don't put NATO on Russia's border. That's what you know. And if the New York Times were doing its job, which it doesn't do anymore, and if the Washington Post were doing its job, which it doesn't do anymore, and it was giving some context, some background, some history to fill out what these conflicts are about, we wouldn't be stuck in these conflicts.